Good evening. Welcome to Hodomania by me, Benjamin Simpson. The story this evening is Bunny Ears. That is, Chapter 1 from Wandering India and Nepal. A little history before we start. From January to April of 2001, I traveled through India and Nepal. Yes, that is 21 years ago. Damn. I wrote the first version of these stories when I returned in 2001. I wrote the second, abbreviated versions to read aloud at Story Salon in 2006. I sent the first 3 chapters to publishers in 2010 and received a few rejection letters. Logically, I should throw these stories away. Throw out your first novel, they say. But I like these stories. So I blew off the dust, wiped away the metaphorical cobwebs, moved, adjusted, coaxed, argued with myself, deleted, added, and eventually resigned myself to never getting them perfect. Another piece of history. This was 2 years before my first digital camera and 5 years before my first cell phone. So, before leaving for India, I bought 25 rolls of 400 speed, 36 exposure film. Most of the rolls were color, but a few of them were black and white. I carried them with me the whole trip. I love the memory of arriving home, taking the rolls to the drugstore, waiting a few days, and eventually sitting at home opening those envelopes, the ones with the negative pouch attached to the front, to see all the photographs for the first time. Some of the photographs were out of focus, some missed what I wanted to convey, some subtly changed the story in my head, but so many brought back smiles, thoughts, and maybe even a tear or two. There are 60 photographs tied to the Bunny Ears story. I recommend listening to the story, then heading over to my website and looking at the photographs. I contemplated saying that you should wait 3 months, because I had to wait 3 months to see the photographs, but that's stupid. I was there. I didn't need to see the photographs. But anyway, listen to the story, then go to benjaminsimpsonwriting.com, click over to the travel section, and then on to Chapter 1, Bunny Ears. The 2 girls were waiting for me as I stepped from the hotel. The hotel entrance opened into an alleyway. The sun was just beginning to rise, and there were 5-story buildings all around, so the alley was dark. There was just a sliver of pale light high above. The girls were the only people in the murky darkness. They had been standing alone in the dark, waiting for someone just like me to step from the hotel. They were about 6 and 8 years old. The older girl stepped up to me instantly. The younger was interested in something on the other side of an alley, exactly like a curious 6-year-old should. The older girl said something over her shoulder in a kind but insistent sisterly voice, and the smaller girl ran over. They both looked up at me. They had huge brown eyes that looked at me with sorrow and hope and the impish childhood fun of playing a game. Both of their faces were scrubbed clean and their hair combed, but their hair looked like it hadn't been washed in a while. They both wore sundresses and were barefoot. The dresses had once been white with a floral design, but they had been worn and washed so many times they were faded to a soft gray and the flowers were almost invisible in the darkness. The older girl's dress was slightly too large, and the strap kept falling off her shoulder. She repeatedly and unthinkingly kept sliding it back up. She held up one of her hands in a cup gesture. It was filled with tiny white flowers. With her other hand, she reached out for my left wrist, smiling up at me as she did so. This was my first real moment in India. Yesterday, my flight was 8 hours late, and my planned afternoon taxi ride to the hotel had become a midnight taxi ride through empty Mumbai. After sitting in airplanes, airports, and customs for 20 hours, the world had become surreal. Then driving through a brand new world made it even more surreal. I sat in the back of the taxi with my eyes wide, soaking it all in. My brain felt like it had been twisted, just slightly. When the world is familiar but seen from a different perspective, like when you've stayed up all night and your hand looks familiar but also somehow strange and at the same time perfectly normal. Everything both inside and outside the taxi felt like this. Everything looked familiar, but also skewed, weird, and out of kilter. The roads were dark, with just the occasional street light. It was all so different and similar. It was impossible to take it all in. The ride was a blur. There was just the occasional snapshot in my head stuck in my memory. The back alley filled with black lumps, buildings disappearing upward into darkness, a harsh street lamp above a cow. The cow was standing by the side of the road. It was not a black and white advertising cartoon cow that I had grown up with. It was a streetwise gray cow. Its ribs were showing, and the gray horns looked somehow more appropriate, useful, like it lived a life where it needed those horns. The cow looked past my speeding taxi with a "I've seen it all and I don't care anymore" expression. In the hotel, I slept for a couple hours, but the time change woke me in the darkness. I lay in the hotel room and read my book. When the sky started to pale, I went out to see Mumbai, which is when I met the girls. There was a string threaded through the flowers. She used this to wrap them around my wrist. When she first reached out for my hand, I almost flinched away, knowing that this was a transaction, not knowing what she wanted in return, but I let her take my hand and assumed she would ask for money. She finished tying the string to my wrist and looked up at me and smiled. It was a melt-the-heart smile. I smiled and thanked her. She said something in a language I didn't understand. I said, in English, that I didn't understand, which of course she didn't understand, but at the same time understood completely. She said one word in reply: milk. With that one word, she beckoned me to follow. She led the way, with her sister and I following. In the 1-minute walk to the store, my mind filled with thoughts. Thoughts are not really the correct word. It was filled with thousands of ideas, feelings, judgment, prejudices from my life. Thoughts from movies, books, TV, and advertising. The carpet salesman taking the stupid foreigners for all their money. Thoughts of bartering, getting taken. Before I could specifically think, we arrived at a stall built into the side of a building. It was like the classic newspaper stands in New York. A man stood at a counter with all the goods lined up on shelves behind him. The man smiled at the girls, and then he turned and smiled at me. It was a smile I was to get to know intimately in India. Not that I would ever see this man again, but every man who wanted something from me gave me this smile. He stood and beamed at me, his smile had exclamation marks in it, his expression too endearing. "Hello!" exclamation mark. "Welcome to India!" exclamation mark. "We are so glad that you are here!" exclamation mark. "I know you will love our country!" exclamation mark. "Did I mention it's good to meet you? You will buy this from me now!" exclamation mark. He pulled a can from the shelves. It was a huge can, an industrial can used for restaurants and school cafeterias. On the side of the can was a smiling black and white cow. 500, he said. Okay, math, I thought. How badly am I being taken? How much is too much? I don't know. But don't accept the first offer. 500 rupees. 46 rupees to the dollar, so 500 rupees is about $10. My first instinct is to think that this is not much money, but then I adjust my thoughts to the local currency. My cheap hotel room is 500 rupees a night. According to my 1,000-page India travel guide, most of my future hotels would be 200 rupees a night. I shook my head no at the huge can of milk. The man pulled out a smaller can and said, 250. I nod and smile, give him the money, take the can and hand it to the older girl. They both look at me, smile, and scamper down the alleyway. As I walk away from the man in his stall, I put my wrist to my nose and take a deep breath of the tiny flowers. The smell is strong, overpoweringly sickly sweet. I step from the alley onto the main street. The sun is rising to my right, and I step into India with, if not a smile, then a deep sense of calm into something new. It was 30 minutes later, after walking down some quiet Mumbai streets, when I felt guilty that I had not given the girls more. Maybe I should simply have given them money rather than buying the milk. But I wasn't thinking, I told myself. I'm new to this. They asked for milk. I gave them milk. Although I wondered what the first thing the girl said was. Did they sell the milk back to the man in the store? Did they take it back home? Do they have a home? Did they take it to their adult minder? Did they get beaten because they didn't bring home the larger can of milk? Was I thinking about this too much? Was I not thinking enough? Over those first few days, I woke before the sun and walked the city. I walked randomly as the sun rose, turning and weaving with no particular purpose in mind. Walking, just walking. The roads were dark and empty as the light slowly filled the city. One of the first things I saw were the people sleeping on the streets. That's not an accurate statement. They were not sleeping on the street. They were sleeping on the sidewalks, in doorways, in alleyways, beside cars, under trucks, in front of metal roll-up doors, anywhere they could. There were individuals curled in doorways in just their clothes. There were individuals wrapped in blankets. There were couples lying together. There were groups huddled in blankets. An old man sat upright, wrapped in a thin sheet, watching my footsteps with vacant early morning eyes. And I continued walking. I saw a huge banyan tree, with the roots standing proud. The tree was surrounded by a fence and sidewalk. On the sidewalk were huge concrete pipes, 5 foot in diameter, obviously waiting to be installed underground. There was a woman cooking breakfast on a little camp stove next to the pipes, a couple of children around her. A man crawled out of one of the pipes, buttoning up his shirt. There was another family 10 feet away doing the same thing. Every morning, I walked in various directions, and I saw the people sleeping on the streets, only for them to fade away with the awakening city. The city awoke with a few pedestrians, then a bus or two, and maybe a taxi. Then a few of the 1950s bicycles would trundle past. Then suddenly it was a full gridlocked mess. Scooters and motorcycles suicidally weaved through traffic. Rickshaws danced around precariously on 3 wheels. There was even an old double-decker bus trundling along. As the streets slowly filled with people, I continued to walk and watch. The buses lumbered along filled with standing room only, leaving tufts of black smoke on acceleration. The little black and yellow taxis dived back and forth through the thickening traffic, looking for open spaces to speed their journey. Every so often, I would see an oxen or two pulling a cart, like something out of a wrong century. Once, I saw a brand new silver Mercedes glide through the traffic. It stood out like an unexpected gold watch. There were flocks of bicycles. They moved in waves with the traffic lights, like birds skimming along the water. As I walked past an alley, it was full of bicycles, all lined up in a perfect row, and I wondered if anyone grabbed the wrong bike. Or if anyone ever grabbed the right bike? There were men sweeping the streets with brooms straight out of a witch's fairy tale, the trash cans at chest height on spinning poles, so it could easily be flipped upside down and emptied. There were open sewers, open to allow the deluge of monsoon rains to fall into the sewer system. These openings smelled like shit, and my nose would shut down of its own accord, to reopen again a minute later, to the thick, humid smell of exhaust ozone, people, cow dung, the salty ocean, baking bread, and deep fryers. I saw men in their suits and ties, looking clean and tidy, walking with their heads up into grand Victorian buildings. I saw men wearing casual Western button-up shirts and trousers, flocking on bicycles and buses. I turned down one street. The noise and chaos suddenly disappeared. There was almost no one walking and driving down this street. The buildings looked like they had been bombed. Some of the frontages were missing with rooms visible. People sat in the ruins and quietly watched me walk past. It was between 9 and 10 in the morning when the rush hour calmed down and the salesmen came out. I was staying in the Colaba district, also known as the tourist district. The Victoria Hotel and the Gateway of India Arch were just down the street. After my early morning walks in solitude, there was a distinct shift to being accosted multiple times each block by salesmen in the tourist district. After a short time, I became used to the patter of salesmen. They all had the same wording and rhythm. I daydreamed about a school for salesmen near the Colaba, teaching the men how to sell. And I say men, because they were all men, and they all wore the same sort of uniform: Western button-up shirts, Western slacks, and Western dress shoes. The script they use went like this. "Where from?" was the inevitable first question, with the obligatory milk salesman exclamation mark smile. "The United States," I would answer. They would make some perfunctory remark about it being a good country, and then continue with the pitch. "How long India?" they would ask. The first instance, I said, "India is 1,000 miles long," but all I got was confusion, so I avoided saying it again and answered with "a few days" from then on. "You like India?" "Yes," I said with a big smile. "It's wonderful. I really love it." But they weren't really listening, the same way that a teller at a grocery store back home never listens to the "how are you" question. Now, with the introductions over, the selling would begin. They knew a great restaurant their uncle owned and would take me there. Their brother had a jewelry store just round the corner, and I would find a beautiful gift for the girl back home. Their friend had a taxi and could take me on a tour of the city for a good price. I'd say no to all of this, saying no again and again. Sometimes they would give up, but sometimes the sales pitch would subtly change. They could take me to the red light district and meet many beautiful women. They could get me hash, and once, when all else failed, I was offered a fun time with his sister. Along with the men roaming and selling, there were boys standing around the India Arch, selling the usual tourist stuff. One even had a monkey on his shoulder. I never bought anything from the sellers. They didn't have anything I wanted to carry around India for 3 months. Except once, when a boy held out a spirograph for my inspection. They say smells take you back, but this little piece of plastic suddenly took me to hours and hours of my childhood, sitting in my room spinning it round and round. There was something so wonderfully simple about a spirograph, and so strange to be selling it to tourists in Mumbai. I stared at this little toy, wondering if it was worth carrying a spirograph around India with me. But to the seller's dismay, I said no. But I would find one when I returned home, I told myself. Walking with my camera in my hand, a man wearing dirty, ragged clothing accosted me and said in mime that I should take his photograph. I smiled and nodded, mentally calculating the rupees to give him. But he was cunning and grabbed a nearby girl who was also wearing ragged clothing. He pulled her into the picture, which doubled the amount in my head. I took the picture and handed over the money, half to him and half to her. They didn't look excited by the amount of money, but at the same time, they didn't look disappointed, so I assumed it was about the right amount. I wondered if he would let her keep the money, or once I left, take it from her. There was one moment that filled me with completely unexpected glee. A man was asking me the questions: where from? How long? You like India? And then he went off script slightly. How long stay India? I answered 3 months, and he rose his eyebrows. But then he asked me another question. You alone? I paused for a moment, creased my forehead, then smiled slightly and said, yes, I'm alone. I paused for another moment, and the young man was just opening his mouth to tell me of his uncle's great restaurant when I started talking first. There's 1 billion people in India, I said, and I know no one, not one person. I suddenly felt light, somehow completely free. There was no one here who knew me, no one to tell me where to go, what to do, how to be. I could do anything and go anywhere. The whole of India was out there waiting to be explored, waiting to be seen. I let out a small giggle. The man looked at me warily. I beamed at this man who had unwittingly made me gloriously happy. I don't know anyone here. Isn't that wonderful? He shrunk back slightly, with all thoughts of selling gone. I stuck out my hand with a big smile and a thank you. He hesitated for a moment before taking it limply. I walked down the street with a spring in my step. I had 3 months to wander India and Nepal, and I had a plan. It was a specifically vague plan. After the week in Mumbai, I would head down the coast, all the way down to the tip of the continent, then up the other side, across the top, and up to the deserts in the northwest. After that, head up into the mountains to Shimla, then back down to the plains, around and up to Nepal. My hotel in Mumbai was pre-booked, but the rest of the time I would wing it, finding hotels out of my guidebook when I arrived in the city, or sleeping on trains. What that meant was that there was a plan, but all the details were up in the air, leaving me to make decisions on vague ideas, random thoughts, whims, and the recommendations of fellow travelers. Over the last 2 years, I'd been working as a bartender in Laguna Beach, California, saving money for this trip and to move. The reason for the visit to Shimla was that the local taxi driver in Laguna Beach was from India, and he told me I had to visit Shimla. Before leaving, I'd quit my job, put my clothes and books in my brother's attic, my tools in his garage, and my motorcycle in his side yard. And I had put my car in a friend's garage. When I returned from India, I was planning on moving to Alaska, but that was in the future. A couple days into Mumbai, with the late morning sun on my back, I went randomly walking, heading vaguely north according to my miniature travel compass and guidebook. There was a jumble of streets marked with nothing interesting. So I went looking for something that wasn't a tourist venue, something mundane. Sometimes wandering lost into mundane places can be wonderfully interesting. Sometimes it can be just mundane. I walked for some time through quiet, small streets, watching the occasional person, looking at the cars, looking at the buildings. And suddenly, around a corner, it all came to life. The street was full. It was a thin street, lined with 3- and 4-story buildings. The street was gridlocked with cars and tiny trucks. Here was life, with the general background noise of busy streets everywhere. It was a market street. The ground floor of all the buildings were shops. Each one had a huge open doorway, mostly rolled-up metal doors, completely open. But strangely, while they all had open doors, most of the goods were on the sidewalk. Walking down the sidewalk, I was stepping over goods for sale. 2 things struck me after I'd walked halfway down the street. Everyone was selling the same thing. They all sold kitchen items: wooden spoons, metal ladles, large plastic bowls, stackable metal lunch tins, and huge wok-like pans. It was weird. Every shop was the same. I also noted that every salesman was a woman. I walked with a huge smile on my face. People standing talking, people walking with bags, people loading, unloading. It made me happy. Walking through a strange city in a strange country, watching people live their lives. I could do this forever. There was something else that made me happy. It was how the people reacted to me. They smiled at me with normal smiles. They saw this tall white guy wandering lost through their market, and they smiled. They didn't try to sell me anything. They didn't accost me for money. They were at work, and they saw me and smiled when I smiled. It felt wonderful to interact with people who didn't want something. The sluggish pedestrian traffic moved only slightly faster than the sluggish cars and trucks. The foot traffic came to a dead stop whenever anyone paused to buy anything, or what seemed more common, to chat. The group of us trying to make our way down the street found ourselves constantly stopping and starting, squeezing past chatting ladies. I tried, once, to step in the gutter to bypass 3 ladies at one table, but I forgot to look for motorcycles. The motorcyclist was not moving very fast, but I stepped directly in front of him. I cringed and looked quickly over my shoulder. The motorcycle had stopped just a foot away. He threw his arm out, flipping his hand up in the international symbol for "get the fuck out of my way." He also said something, which happily I didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. The ladies standing on the sidewalk all looked up at the commotion and then back down again. I was, happily, not very interesting entertainment. I liked this street. At the end of the street, there was another, wider street, and I realized I had wandered into the market. This was not just a market, but a neighborhood. There was no distinction between home or business. It was a confluence of streets, with stalls set up in little squares or shops lined up down busy streets. Apartment buildings stood in the middle of the market, and it felt alive. People lived here. It was a community. It felt good. As I walked, I found that each street or plaza or alley sold something different. There was a section for spices that, even from 20 feet away, I could feel at the back of my throat and in my jaw. There was an automotive street, multiple clothing streets, an electronics street, a fruit and vegetable market, a kitchen street, and a chicken and fish markets. On a slightly larger street were the mechanics and auto parts sellers. Rather than blankets on the street, they each had a square concrete box that was their shop front. There were no doors or front windows. It was just a concrete box open at the front. Their goods tumbled out of these shops onto the sidewalk. I had worked as a mechanic in California, and it felt so familiar and completely different. It seemed like each of these little stores only had one item for sale. There was a used car door shop. There was a number of engine shops with men in dark corners taking them apart or putting them together. A few had boxes and boxes of wrenches and tools. There were shops with piles of alternators, batteries, radiators, tires, transmissions, and rear ends. Every part a car could need. But my favorite was the horn seller. He only sold car horns and had a fabulous advertising gimmick. As I walked down the street, I could hear a horn blare every 10 seconds or so. Although this tended to blend in with the cacophony of horns that was part of the normal background noise of Mumbai. As I walked past, I saw him pull a horn from a pile, attach wires to it, and touch it to a battery. The horn sounded clear and strong. He put it down on a different pile. Picking up the next horn, wires, battery, and again on the good pile. As I continued walking down the street, I could hear the horn seller testing his ware. Smiling, I wondered if the men in the stalls next to him were deaf, or used to the constant blast, or quietly contemplating murder. Later, while walking along a busy street, there was an entrance to my left into some sort of courtyard. Something was going on, people were entering and leaving, so I entered. The bedlam of the street became muffled, but the noise and smell of clucking and fluffing chickens filled the air. This was the chicken market. There were maybe 20 to 30 tiny individual spaces selling chickens. I walked around looking at the men. It was all men, and they looked curiously back at me. It was impossible to tell when one stall began and one ended, but they all had similar implements. A stack of wooden, metal, bamboo cages with chickens inside, a tree stump wooden block with a machete stuck in the top, and a 55-gallon drum full of murky water. I saw a man pull out a chicken, put it on the tree stump, chop off its head with one thump of the machete, and hold it while the blood poured out onto the stump. I could see both the fresh red drops running down the side and the dried black drops from previous chickens. I pulled out my camera and asked with pantomime to take their picture. Suddenly I was popular. They wanted their picture taken with their chickens. I took their pictures, while at the same time noting their bare feet, dirty water, and the flies. I had contemplated being vegetarian while in India. It was a vegetarian country, so it seemed like a good idea. After being in the chicken market, I was decided being vegetarian in India was a good idea. Up the street was a patchwork of tarps covering and delineating a square about the size of half a football field. I decided to see what was inside. Once I stepped over the threshold, the stench struck me. Like stepping in an air-conditioned building, it was a complete change of atmosphere. This was definitely the fish market. I'm not a huge fan of fish. To me, it tastes like the smell of low tide. This was a wall of low tide smell. The wonderful deep-fried samosa I had had for lunch did a somersault in my stomach, and I burped, and could taste the samosa again, and not in a good way. Sitting in front of me, with no ice or refrigeration, were a couple of fish the size of large dogs. The fish were missing their heads. On the floor nearby were 3 fish heads, each the size of a cat. The fish heads stared straight up at the tarp ceiling. The blood from their decapitated heads soaked into the grooves of the flagstones. I stopped and blindly stepped backwards, stepping into the lady who was entering the market after me. I stepped out of the way and apologized. Out of the market, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tiny flower bracelet. I had cut it off but was carrying it around in my pocket. I put the sickly sweet flowers to my nose and mentally thanked the girls, with just a twinge of guilt that I should have given them more money. There is, on the other side of the Mumbai Peninsula, a bay, with a mosque on an island in the middle. The only way to reach the mosque is on a stone walkway, just like St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall. I thought it would be nice to walk on the causeway, but I needed a taxi to get me there. To get a general idea of the price of the taxi ride, I consulted the travel book, asked at the hotel counter, and made a guess. Over months in India, I would hone my skills on hiring a taxi. Today, I was still a novice, but my basic approach would be the same. Walk towards the conglomeration of taxis. Without saying a word, become surrounded by taxi drivers exclaiming to me the good hotel, the good tour, the market they would take me to. I would stand there with a half smile on my face. Later, I would learn the Indian nod-shake gesture, but today I just smiled. After a minute or two, the salesmanship dissipated, and a few of the drivers wandered off. I said, Haji Ali Mosque. The exclamation mark smiles returned with statements of better and further away, places they could take me. I stood and smiled and let it flow over me in waves. A few more of the taxi drivers wandered off. One of the taxi drivers said yes, he would take me there. I asked for a price. He told me a price, twice the amount in my head. I shook my head no, and said the price that I expected to pay. He looked like I was murdering his children. I turned to walk away. He gave me a lower price. I gave him an alternate price. Eventually, we decided on a price that was halfway between his and my price. I knew that it was more than the locals were paying, but it was less than his initial price. I could live with that. After driving across town, the taxi stopped. I looked around and saw the blue ocean on the other side of a 6-lane highway. The cars sped along with murder in their headlights. I was not walking across that. Crinkling my forehead at the driver, he pointed to the entrance of a pedestrian undercrossing just up the way, next to an empty field. I did the international, boy am I stupid, facial expression and thanked him. The empty field was dirt and weeds and a few piles of junk. There was a group of children playing. There was a lady sitting on a wooden crate watching the children. The children wore rags and played in one corner of the field. The lady wore a nice, clean, colorful sari. The lady saw me climbing out of the taxi and turned and yelled at the children. It was not a kind yell. It was a demanding, bitter yell. The children paused in their playing. When she had their attention, she turned, looked, and pointed directly at me. The children instantly surrounded me, talking, begging, cajoling. Suddenly I was angry at this lady using these children, angry at the lady for wearing a bright, new, clean sari while the children wore rags, angry at her using them, angry at all the begging, all the children in rags, all the homeless. All of this came to a head pointing directly at her. The children begged in the same way that children all over India would beg from me. They asked for rupees, school pencil, candy, school paper, and of course, milk. The children knew or were told to ask for school supplies because this obviously worked. School pencil was a refrain I was to hear often. Walking directly towards the undercrossing, it became obvious to the children that I was not going to give them anything. They became bolder, moving in closer, reaching out and touching my arm, touching my backpack. I spun back and forth in a 180-degree twist to keep their hands off me and out of my pockets. Right now, I was angry. I wanted to scream at the lady, but that wouldn't do any good. I made it a point when I was spinning to not make any sharp movements or strike the children, other than softly keep their hands off me. The children followed me down the steps of the pedestrian tunnel. I carefully watched my feet while still spinning to keep their hands out of my pockets and backpack. I was angry, my thoughts black, so I didn't notice at the time, but the vision of me walking down steps, spinning back and forth, surrounded by children, would have looked comical. After 10 steps into the dark underground tunnel, the children gave up and ran back up the stairs. Standing, overlooking the bay, there was a pale blue sky, high and clear. There was the stone walkway that reached out half a mile to the mosque set on an island. The mosque was pure white, with a square fortress-like facade. There were palm trees and a tall round minaret for calling to prayer. The tide was out, which marred the beauty slightly. The rocks and mud of the bay displayed the trash, and it smelt of low tide and human waste. The walkway was a beautiful single white curve leading out. On it were hundreds of people, and the colorful saris of the women was a beautiful line of color. I took a moment, took some deep breaths till I felt better. Eventually, I began to walk along the causeway to the mosque. On my left were women sitting on blankets selling the usual trinkets, religious icons, postcards, jewelry, plastic toys, miniature monuments, candy, incense, engraved pens, ashtrays, and of course, school pencils. On my right were beggars. Since arriving in Mumbai, I had seen homeless, I had seen beggars. It had become a normal sight while walking. But the beggars sitting on the walkway were a completely different sight. The first was missing both his legs from the knees down. The second was missing all his fingers. The third was missing a foot and a leg. The fourth was a woman holding a crying baby. The fifth, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth, all the way out to the mosque. Some of the people were lying on blankets, some on cardboard, some on the stone walkway. A few had umbrellas to keep off the Mumbai sun. Almost all of them had begging bowls or cups, but many of them couldn't hold them. Many of them were stick-thin, with pale brown parchment skin stretched over the stump of a missing hand or leg. There was something more than this. It was the dead look in the eyes. There were many who watched me as I walked past, with eyes that still seemed alive. But there were many more that had a blank stare, like they had given up, like there was no point, like they had been beaten down so much there was no point in getting up. There was a lady holding a small baby, and the baby wasn't crying. It just lay in her arms, staring blankly. This was worse than the crying baby. I walked up the center of the walkway with all the other people walking up the walkway. I wanted to look at the people, but at the same time I didn't want to see. I walked with my head down, looking at my feet and the flagstones. When I glanced to my left, there was a seller with an exclamation mark smile holding up something for me to buy. I glanced away and saw a man laying in the sun, missing his leg. I was trying not to think, trying not to notice, and I kept walking, looking up at the mosque and walking. Arriving at the mosque, I really didn't see it. I walked between separate buildings, with shoes neatly lined up outside. On the other side, there were stones leading down to the low tide. I sat down on the stones. I wanted a cigarette, but thought it might be sacrilegious next to the mosque. I sat there and stared at the water, swirling thoughts through my mind. I sat there and felt horror, shame, guilt, fear. I could feel the blood pumping quickly through my veins. I sat and breathed as slowly as possible. I thought of the money I had given and how it was useless, like a drop in the ocean. Time passed, and I knew I would have to walk back, and geared myself up for the walk. I looked around and saw there were other people out here on the rocks, spending time with their families. I took a picture of the view from my rock of the Mumbai skyline. Walking back through the collected buildings of the mosque, I walked past a young man, and he gave me an angry stare. He saw a tourist with a camera walking through his holy site. On the walk back, I took pictures of the people on the walkway. I didn't have the courage to ask to take their picture, so I walked with my camera by my side and clicked the shutter, hoping that they would be good pictures. Looking back on this with my today perspective, I know that holding a camera up can be a shield, a form of mental distance between me and the subject. When things get really bad, it's easier to look through a lens and take a picture than actually deal with it. I concentrated on pointing the camera from my hip. As I walked, I had a few of the people look up at me with their flat eyes, and I looked straight back at them. The walk back along the causeway took forever. Back on the mainland, I saw the pedestrian tunnel and thought of the woman and the begging children. Knowing I couldn't go that way, I blindly turned right, south, along the coast. I needed to walk, keep moving, keep walking, don't think. I turned off the main road, following a smaller road, closer to the water. There were a few stores, and then houses, as the road gently headed up a hill. Soon the small houses changed into large Victorian mansions. They looked out of place. They must have been built here, on this rise of land, overlooking the water, for the British when they ruled this land. But the houses were no longer mansions. The large front gardens were occasionally well kept, and occasionally overgrown and filled with trash. The grand front door, at the top of the grand front steps, had been converted into 4 small doors. I walked up the street, looking at the remnants of the British, and wondered how much of the poverty, the homeless, how much of the people on the causeway was because the British sucked all the wealth out of this country for hundreds of years. I grew up in both England and the United States, the richest countries in the world. How much of my easy upbringing was tied to this poverty? In between the houses were occasional wide alleyways. I walked up one of these, and there was a young man and woman on one of the balconies. They looked at me, and I looked at them. The man looked down at my camera. I pulled it up and mimed to take their photograph. They posed for the photo. I took the picture. We smiled at each other. Walking back to the street, there was a mound of trash. Laying on the edge of this trash was the body of a dead kitten. I continued to walk. The neighborhood changed again into smaller houses and then small shops. There was a dirt field surrounded by small buildings. There was a cricket game in progress. I leant against the fence and watched the game for some time. It was soothing, people playing the familiar rituals, reminders of playing childhood games of cricket on the beach. Walking with my camera still in my hand, the road opened out into a confluence of roads. There were people going about their lives, shops open, trucks unloading, people with shopping bags. I walked past 4 men sitting on a bench, doing nothing in particular. One of the men looked at me and I smiled, and he smiled back. They could have been anywhere in the world, playing chess in an Italian piazza, outside an English pub, high in the Andes, or in a square in China. I pointed to my camera and pointed to them. They smiled and nodded, adjusting themselves and posing for the camera. I took the picture. One of the men said something to the others and they all laughed. Then he said something to me while pointing across the street. I had no idea what he was saying, but looked at where he was pointing. There was a man selling betel nuts from a cart. The men laughed, and I knew they wanted me to take his picture. I walked across the street to the betel nut salesman. He looked at me shyly, like it was normal for these men to give him grief, in a friendly, shoulder-hitting sort of way. I asked to take his picture. He agreed, and I took his picture. Young girls, maybe 7 years old, wearing the school uniforms, were walking by at that moment, and they were eyeing my camera. I asked their motherly chaperone if I could take their picture. She smiled and nodded. I put up the camera, and she stepped out of the picture. I slightly lowered the camera and beckoned her to join in. She shook her head and took another step away. The girls stared at the camera, or each other, each with their own individual smile. I knew that that was going to be a good picture. The road continued, and I walked uphill, out of the shopping district, into an area of high-rise apartments. Near the top, there was a flat concrete plateau, probably waiting for another high-rise. There was a boy flying his kite in this empty space. He noticed me and came over to investigate. He smiled at me. I smiled back and held up the camera. He nodded, and I took a picture of him looking down at me from his concrete perch. He motioned with his hands up and down, palms down, asking me to stay where I was. I smiled and nodded and waited. In a few minutes he came back with his friends. 8 to 10 boys, acting exactly like boys, pushing, laughing, poking, trying to shove their way to the front of the picture. The hairs on my arm rose. I could feel my eyes just starting to water. One of the boys held up 2 fingers behind the head of another boy. Bunny ears. He was doing bunny ears. The last few days, the begging, the selling, the causeway all came to a head, and I saw the bunny ears, and it was so familiar and simple and human. I thanked the boys and blinked back tears as they ran away. An hour ago, I wondered if I should stay in India. Now I was happy to be here. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.